The moment Lenora Whitfield whispered, "I do," at gunpoint wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing her own father had sold her to settle a debt, handed her over to Boone Mercer, the scarred rancher everyone in Copper Hollow feared more than wolves. They said he'd buried 2 wives already. They said he bought women the way other men bought cattle. Standing at that altar in a borrowed dress, 20 years old and worthless as dirt, Lenora knew her life was over. But what she didn't know, the monster waiting across that altar was hiding secrets that would shatter everything she thought she understood about mercy, survival, and what it means to be owned. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The wedding dress didn't fit. Lenora could feel it gaping at the back where Mrs. Henderson's hasty stitching had failed to account for how much weight she'd lost in the past month. The fabric smelled like camphor and somebody else's hope, probably the Henderson girl who'd worn it 3 years ago before running off to San Francisco with a theater troupe. At least that girl had chosen her fate. At least she'd had somewhere to run. Lenora had nowhere. The church was freezing. Late October in Copper Hollow meant mornings that cracked ice on water troughs and turned breath into ghosts. Someone had tried to warm the space with a pitiful fire in the corner stove, but the heat barely reached past the first 2 pews. Lenora stood near the altar shivering, though she couldn't tell if it was the cold or the terror making her shake. Every soul in town had showed up. Not because they cared about her. Nobody had cared about the Whitfield family since the drought started 5 years back. But because a spectacle was a spectacle, and watching Thomas Whitfield's daughter get handed over to Boone Mercer was the most exciting thing to happen in Copper Hollow since the Miller barn burned down last spring. She could hear them whispering. The sound crawled up her spine like insects. Poor thing. Her daddy didn't even fight it. What choice did he have? That broker would have taken the land, the house, everything. Still, your own daughter. Mercer will break her inside a month. You see the way he looks? Like something died behind his eyes. Lenora kept her gaze locked on the rough-hewn floorboards. Someone had tried to sweep, but dirt and old straw still clung to the gaps between planks. She focused on that, counted the pieces of straw she could see. Anything to avoid looking at the faces staring at her like she was livestock at auction. Her father stood 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the whiskey he'd been drinking since dawn. Thomas Whitfield had been a decent man once, or so her mother used to say before the fever took her. These days he was mostly a collection of debts held together by shame and rot-gut liquor. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Hadn't met them since the broker arrived 2 weeks ago with papers and that horrible smile. "It's for the best, Lenore," he'd said, hands shaking as he signed away his daughter's life. "Mercer's agreeing to clear everything. The land stays ours. Your brothers keep the farm." "And what do I keep?" she'd asked. He hadn't answered. The door at the back of the church opened with a groan that made everyone turn. Cold wind shot down the aisle, guttering candles and sending shivers through the assembled crowd. Lenora finally looked up. Boone Mercer filled the doorway like an avalanche waiting to happen. He wasn't what people would call handsome. His face was too hard for that, all sharp angles and old scars that suggested a life spent fighting things that fought back. Tall enough that he had to duck coming through the door. Broad through the shoulders in a way that made his dark coat look like it was struggling to contain something dangerous. His hair was black, going gray at the temples, pulled back and tied with a leather cord that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that made Lenora's stomach drop. Empty. That's what they looked like. 2 dark holes where something human used to live. He walked down the aisle slowly, boots heavy on the wood. Nobody spoke. Even the whispering died. There was something about Boone Mercer that made people remember they were small, breakable things. He stopped across from Lenora and nodded once to her father. Thomas Whitfield flinched like he'd been struck. "She's all yours," her father muttered, then stepped back fast, putting distance between himself and what he'd done. Boone's eyes shifted to Lenora for the first time. She forced herself not to look away, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. His gaze moved over her face. Not leering, not cruel, just assessing. Like he was trying to figure out what he'd gotten himself into. After a long moment, something flickered across his expression. She couldn't name it. Regret, maybe, or recognition. Then it was gone, and his face returned to stone. Pastor Williams cleared his throat nervously. He was a small man, made smaller by Boone's presence. Well, shall we begin? Nobody answered. The pastor took that as agreement and opened his Bible with trembling hands. Dearly beloved, skip it, Boone said. His voice was low, rough from disuse. Get to the part that matters. Pastor Williams blinked. The ceremony is traditional. I don't care about tradition. Say the words that make it legal. Lenora felt something inside her crack. Not break. Not yet. But crack. Like ice starting to give way under weight. This was really happening. This was real. The pastor swallowed hard and flipped through pages with shaking fingers. Very well, do you, Boone Mercer, take this woman? I do. To be your lawfully wedded, you can't just... There are vows. Boone's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness made the pastor stop talking immediately. Fine, Williams squeaked. Do you, Lenora Ann Whitfield, take this man? The words stuck in her throat. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She could feel everyone watching, waiting, her father's shame burning behind her, the townspeople's hungry curiosity pressing in from all sides, and Boone Mercer standing across from her like a mountain that would never move, never bend, never care what she wanted. She don't have to, someone called from the back. Girl's got a choice. Lenora turned. Jacob Porter stood near the door, hat in his hands, looking like he wanted to disappear but couldn't quite manage it. He'd courted her once, back before the drought, before everything turned to dust and desperation. Sweet boy, useless boy. He'd stopped coming around the moment her father's debts became common knowledge. Stay out of this, Porter, her father snapped. I'm just saying she don't have to... Well, she does if we want to keep our land. Thomas Whitfield's face had gone red. You offering to pay our debts, boy? You got $3,000 hiding in your pocket? Jacob went pale. $3,000 was more money than most folks in Copper Hollow would see in a lifetime. Didn't think so, her father continued. So shut your mouth and let the girl do what needs doing. Lenora looked back at Boone. He was watching her now with those empty eyes, and for just a second she thought she saw something else there. Something that might have been an apology. Or maybe she was imagining it because she needed to believe this man was human. Do you take this man, Pastor Williams repeated quietly, to be your lawfully wedded husband? Her whole world had already collapsed. What was one more piece of rubble? I do, Lenora whispered. The pastor sagged with relief. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you man and wife. You may... But Boone was already turning away, heading back down the aisle toward the door. He didn't kiss her, didn't take her hand, didn't acknowledge her at all. Just left, like he'd finished an errand and had more important things to do. Lenora stood frozen at the altar, still wearing the dress that didn't fit, still shaking from cold or fear or both. Go on then, her father said behind her. He's your husband now, your responsibility. Not you're married, not be happy, just your responsibility, like she was the one who'd chosen this. The townspeople started filing out, already gossiping, already moving on to the next thing. Only Mrs. Henderson paused long enough to squeeze Lenora's shoulder. He ain't killed anyone yet, she offered. That's something. Then she was gone too, and Lenora was alone in the freezing church, with nothing but the borrowed dress and the gold ring Boone had shoved onto her finger without ceremony. It was too big. She'd have to wrap thread around the band to keep it from falling off. Outside, she could hear a wagon being loaded, her trunk, the small one containing everything she owned, getting thrown into a buckboard with all the care someone might give a sack of grain. She made herself walk down the aisle, made herself push through the doors into the gray October morning. Boone sat in the driver's seat of a sturdy wagon hitched to two massive draft horses. He didn't look at her as she approached, just stared straight ahead at the road leading out of town, up into the mountains where his ranch waited. Mercer Ridge. She'd never been there, but everyone knew about it. Isolated, brutal. Miles from the nearest neighbor, built in a valley so remote that winters could trap you for months. They said Boone Mercer had carved that ranch out of wilderness with his bare hands, fought off rustlers and wolves in winters that killed weaker men. They said he'd buried a wife and son up there during a blizzard so fierce their bodies weren't found until spring. They said a lot of things about Boone Mercer, and none of them were good. Get in, he said without turning. Lenora climbed onto the bench seat, careful not to touch him. The dress caught on a splinter and tore a little. She didn't bother fixing it. What did it matter now? Boone snapped the reins and the horses lurched forward. The wagon rolled through Copper Hollow's single street, past the general store and the saloon and the feed office where her father had signed the papers that sold her. A few people watched from windows and doorways. Nobody waved goodbye. They left town behind and started climbing into the mountains. Neither of them spoke. Jianbin. The road, if you could call it that, was barely more than wheel ruts carved through pine forest and granite outcrops. The wagon jolted over rocks and roots, throwing Lenore against the hard bench. She gripped the edge to steady herself, knuckles white. An hour passed, then 2. The trees grew thicker, the air colder. Clouds moved in, heavy and gray with the promise of snow. Lenore's thin shawl did nothing against the wind that cut through the mountain passes. Finally, Boone reached behind the seat and pulled out a heavy wool coat. He thrust it toward her without a word. She stared at it. "I don't—" "Take it," he said. "You freeze to death. I gotta explain that to folks." "Rather not." "Not kindness, then. Just practicality." She took the coat and wrapped it around herself. It smelled like pine smoke and leather, and something else she couldn't name. The warmth was immediate, almost painful against her frozen skin. "Thank you," she said quietly. He didn't respond. Another hour. The sun started sinking toward the western peaks, turning the clouds orange and purple. Lenora realized with growing horror that they were going to arrive at Mercer Ridge after dark, in unfamiliar territory, with a man she didn't know and had every reason to fear. "How much farther?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "Another hour, maybe less." "Will we make it before full dark?" No. That was it. Just no. No reassurance, no explanation. The conversation died again. Lenora pulled the coat tighter and tried not to think about what waited at the end of this road. Tried not to imagine the ranch house where she'd spend the rest of her life. Tried not to picture what would happen tonight, what Boone Mercer would expect from the woman he'd bought, because that's what this was. Everyone could pretend it was a marriage, could use words like arrangement and agreement, but the truth was simpler and uglier. Her father had owed money. Boone Mercer had paid it, and Lenora was the transaction that made it square. The last light faded from the sky. Boone lit a lantern hanging from the wagon's front corner. The yellow glow pushed back the darkness maybe 10 feet, enough to see the road and not much else. The forest pressed in on both sides, full of sounds, wind through branches, animals moving through underbrush, the distant scream of something that might have been a mountain lion. Lenora had never felt so far from everything she knew. "You scared?" Boone asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. She'd almost forgotten he could speak. "Yes," she admitted. "What was the point of lying?" He nodded slowly, like that made sense. "Good." "Good? Means you ain't stupid." He glanced at her for the first time since leaving town. In the lantern light, his face looked even harder, all shadows and sharp edges. "Lot of things to be scared of up here. Mountain lions, bears. Weather can kill you if you ain't careful. Falling rock, bad water. 100 different ways to die if you don't respect what you're dealing with." "And you?" The words came out before she could stop them. "Should I be scared of you?" The wagon hit a rut and threw them both sideways. When they settled, Boone was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Probably," he finally said. "I scare most people." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her again, and something in his expression shifted. Not softening, Boone Mercer didn't seem capable of soft, but changing somehow. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said. "If that's what you're asking." "Why should I believe you?" "No reason to, but it's true. You bought me. Paid your father's debt." "Same thing." "No," he said, and there was an edge to his voice now. "It ain't." Lenora wanted to argue, wanted to throw all her fear and anger at him, but exhaustion was catching up with her. She'd barely slept in 2 weeks, too terrified about what was coming. Now it was here, and she was too tired to fight anymore. "There," Boone said, pointing ahead. Through the trees, Lenora could make out lights. The ranch. Mercer Ridge sat in a valley carved between 2 mountain slopes, protected from the worst winds, but isolated enough that help was days away if trouble came. The main house was bigger than she'd expected. 2 stories of solid timber construction with a wide porch and stone chimney. Outbuildings clustered around it. A barn, storage sheds, what looked like a bunkhouse. Corrals held horses and cattle, dark shapes moving in the night. The whole place had a fortress quality to it, built to endure, built to survive whatever the mountains threw at it. Boone pulled the wagon up to the front porch and set the brake. He climbed down, then stood there awkwardly for a moment before offering his hand to help Lenora down. She ignored it and climbed down herself, catching her boot on the dress and nearly falling. Boone caught her elbow to steady her, then let go immediately, like touching her burned. "Your trunk," he said, hefting it like it weighed nothing. "I'll take it inside." He walked up the porch steps and through the front door, leaving it open behind him. Yellow light spilled out into the darkness. Lenora stood in the yard trying to make her feet move. This was it. Once she walked through that door, there was no going back. This would be her life. This house, this man, this isolation. A horse whinnied in the barn. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of coming snow. She was freezing without the coat Boone had left in the wagon. Her wedding dress, still not her wedding dress, still borrowed, still wrong, flapped around her legs. There was nowhere else to go. Lenora climbed the steps and walked inside. The interior was not what she expected. Clean, for one thing. Sparse, but well maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, fire already built and crackling. Simple furniture arranged with purpose rather than decoration. A kitchen area in the back with a cast-iron stove and sturdy table. Stairs leading up to what must be bedrooms. And books. An entire wall of shelves packed with books. That surprised her more than anything else. Boone stood near the fireplace, still holding her trunk. "Second door on the right, upstairs," he said. "That's your room." "My room. You got a problem with that?" "I thought—" She stopped, not sure how to say it. "You thought I'd put you in mine." It wasn't a question. He set down the trunk with a heavy thud. "Door's got a lock. Inside lock. You use it if you want." Lenora stared at him. "I don't understand." "What's to understand? You get your own room, your own space. Lock works from the inside, so I can't get in unless you let me in." "But you're my—" "I know what I am." His jaw tightened. "Don't mean I'm going to force anything. You want to lock your door every night, lock it. You want to stay in there all day and never come out, that's your choice too." "Then why did you—" She gestured helplessly at everything. "Why pay the debt? Why marry me at all?" Boone walked to the fireplace and stared into the flames. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, harder to hear. "Had my reasons. They ain't your concern right now. All you need to know is you're safe here. You got a roof, a bed, food. Nobody's going to bother you, not even me." "I don't believe you." He turned to look at her, and in the firelight she could see how tired he looked. How old, even though he couldn't be more than 35. "Don't care if you believe me or not. Time will show you I'm telling the truth." Before she could respond, he grabbed his coat from a peg by the door and shrugged into it. "There's stew on the stove if you're hungry, bread in the box by the sink. I got work to do in the barn. I'll be out there most of the night, so you'll have the house to yourself. Get settled. Sleep if you can." "Wait, you're leaving?" "Told you, I got work. It's our wedding night." The words hung in the air between them. Boone's expression went carefully blank. "Yeah, it is." He opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air. "Like I said, lock your door if you want to." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Lenora stood alone in the strange house, in the borrowed dress, with a gold ring sliding around her finger and absolutely no idea what had just happened. She waited, listening for his footsteps to return, for the door to open again, for the truth to reveal itself, because this couldn't be real, couldn't be the whole story. Men didn't pay $3,000 for a wife and then leave her alone on their wedding night. Men didn't give women their own rooms with locks on the inside. There had to be a catch. There had to be. But the door stayed closed. Through the window, she could see lantern light moving in the barn. Boone doing whatever work he'd claimed was so important. Lenora's legs finally gave out. She sat down hard on the floor in front of the fire, still wearing the dress, still shaking, still terrified, but now also confused in a way that made everything worse. She'd prepared herself for cruelty, for violence, for all the horrible things men did to women they thought they owned. She hadn't prepared for this. Didn't know what to do with a monster who gave her a room with a lock, who wrapped her in his coat when she was cold, who walked away on their wedding night like it meant nothing. The fire crackled and popped. The house settled around her with creaks and groans as the temperature dropped outside. Somewhere in the mountains, something howled. Lenora pulled her knees to her chest and tried very hard not to cry. She failed. What? When she finally stopped shaking, the fire had burned down to embers, and her face felt stiff from dried tears. The house was silent except for the wind outside and the occasional pop from the dying fire. She couldn't stay on the floor all night. Lenora forced herself to stand on unsteady legs. Her trunk still sat where Boone had left it, next to the stairs. She picked it up, lighter than it should be because there wasn't much inside worth saving, and climbed to the second floor. 4 doors. The first stood open, revealing what was clearly Boone's room, a bed barely big enough for his frame, a dresser, nothing else. Spartan as a monk's cell. The second door, her door, was closed. She turned the knob slowly, half expecting some trap. But it was just a room, small but clean, a bed with actual sheets and quilts, a dresser, a chair by the window, a wash basin on a stand, and yes, a lock on the inside of the door. Lenora set down her trunk and closed the door behind her. The lock was simple but sturdy. She engaged it with a soft click that seemed too loud in the quiet house. Then she stood there, listening. No footsteps on the stairs, no handle rattling, no demands. Just silence. She changed out of the borrowed dress slowly, folding it carefully even though she never wanted to see it again. Her own nightgown was threadbare but familiar, smelling like the lavender her mother used to grow before the drought killed her garden. The bed was softer than anything she'd slept on in years. The quilts were heavy and warm. Through the window she could still see lantern light in the barn. Lenora pulled the quilts up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. This was her life now. This room, this house, this strange, silent man who scared entire towns but gave his unwanted wife a lock on her door. She didn't understand any of it, but for the first time since her father had told her about the arrangement, Lenora felt something other than pure terror. Not hope. She wasn't foolish enough for hope. But maybe just the smallest possibility that she might survive this after all. Outside, the wind picked up. The lantern in the barn finally went dark, and Lenora, exhausted beyond measure, finally slept. She dreamed of mountains and empty eyes and doors that locked from the inside. When she woke the next morning, she would start trying to understand the man who had bought her freedom and then given it back. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight she just needed to survive, and against all odds, she had. Morning came with the smell of coffee and something burning. Lenora woke disoriented, tangled in quilts she didn't recognize, in a room she'd seen for the first time the night before. For one blessed second, she didn't remember where she was or why. Then it all came rushing back. The church, the dress, the empty-eyed man who'd bought her father's freedom with her life. She was married to Boone Mercer, and she was alone in a house miles from anything resembling civilization. The burning smell got stronger. Lenora threw off the quilts and discovered she'd slept in her nightgown, which meant at some point last night her exhaustion had beaten her fear. The floor was cold enough to make her gasp when her feet hit it. She grabbed her shawl and cracked open the door. The hallway was empty. Boone's door stood open, his room vacant. Downstairs she could hear movement, heavy footsteps, the clang of cast iron, muttered cursing that would have made Pastor Williams faint. She crept down the stairs slowly, not sure what she'd find. Boone stood at the stove, glaring at a pan like it had personally offended him. Smoke poured from whatever he was attempting to cook. He'd pushed the windows open despite the cold, trying to air out the kitchen. "That ain't gonna work," Lenora said before she could stop herself. He spun around and she realized this was the first time she'd seen him startled. The expression vanished almost immediately, replaced by his usual stone-faced neutrality, but for half a second he'd looked almost human. "Didn't hear you come down," he said. "You were too busy burning breakfast." He looked back at the pan, then grabbed a rag and pulled it off the heat. Whatever had been in there was now charcoal. "Was trying to make eggs." "How long were you cooking them?" "Don't know. Half hour, maybe." Lenora stared at him. "You can't cook eggs for half an hour." "Clearly." He dumped the smoking mess into a bucket by the door. "There's bread and some preserves Mrs. Henderson sent up last month. That'll have to do. Or I could make breakfast." The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. But standing there watching this massive, terrifying man fumble with basic cooking felt wrong somehow. like watching a bear try to thread a needle. You don't have to, Boone said carefully. I know I don't have to. I'm offering. She moved toward the stove before he could argue. You got more eggs? He pointed to a basket on the counter. Chickens out back, collected them this morning. Lenora picked up the pan he'd destroyed, examined the carbonized remains, and set it aside. She found a clean one, added a small amount of lard from the crock by the stove, and waited for it to heat properly. The motions were familiar, comforting even. She'd been cooking since she was 7 years old, since her mother got too sick to stand for long periods. Boone watched her from across the kitchen like she was performing some kind of magic trick. You just gonna stand there? She asked. Didn't want to get in your way. You're not in my way. You live here. She cracked eggs into the pan with practiced efficiency. Where's your coffee? Made it already, should still be hot. She found 2 tin cups hanging from hooks and poured for both of them. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot and it was caffeine. She handed 1 cup to Boone without looking at him. He took it like she'd handed him something fragile. Thank you. They stood in awkward silence while the eggs cooked. Lenora could feel his eyes on her, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. It made her skin crawl, but she forced herself not to react. You sleep all right? He asked finally. Well enough. Room's adequate. It's fine. Need anything? Extra blankets? Different? It's fine, she repeated, more sharply than she intended. She didn't know how to do this. This strange dance of normalcy when nothing about their situation was normal. I'm not going to fall apart if you don't treat me like glass. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but close. Noted. She plated the eggs with bread and set his portion on the table. They sat across from each other, and Lenora was struck by how domestic it all looked. If someone walked in right now, they'd see a husband and wife having breakfast together. They wouldn't see the debt or the fear or the fact that she'd locked her door last night and woken up surprised to still be alive. Boone ate methodically, not like he was enjoying the food, but like he was fueling his body for work. He finished before she was halfway done. I got cattle to check on the North Ridge, he said, standing. Won't be back until afternoon. What am I supposed to do? He paused, like the question hadn't occurred to him. Whatever you want. House is yours. There's books if you read. Sewing supplies in the chest by the window if you do that. Chickens need feeding around midday. Grains in the barn, second barrel from the left. You're just leaving me here? You want to come check cattle in freezing weather? No, but then I'm leaving you here. He grabbed his coat from the peg. There's a rifle over the door if you need it. You know how to shoot? Lenora shook her head. Then don't touch it unless something's trying to kill you. And if something is trying to kill you, aim for the biggest part and keep pulling the trigger until it stops moving. He opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air. I'll be back before dark. Then he was gone, just like last night, just walking away like she didn't exist. Lenora sat at the table for a long time after he left, picking at her eggs and trying to understand what her life had become. She'd expected cruelty or demands or at minimum some kind of control. What she'd gotten instead was a locked room, coffee, and instructions about feeding chickens. It didn't make sense. Nothing about Boone Mercer made sense. She cleaned up breakfast because there was nothing else to do, then explored the house more carefully. The main floor was simple. Kitchen, living area with the fireplace and book-lined wall, a small room in the back that looked like an office with a desk and more books. Everything was clean but worn, like it had been used hard and maintained carefully. The books surprised her most. Technical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry mixed with novels she recognized. Cooper, Irving, even some poetry. Someone had read these books. Multiple times, based on the where. She'd expected Boone Mercer to be illiterate or close to it. Men like him usually were. Apparently she'd expected wrong. Upstairs there were 4 bedrooms. Hers, Boone's, and 2 others, both with doors that stuck when she tried them, like they hadn't been opened in a long time. She forced one open and immediately wished she hadn't. A child's room, small bed, toy horse on the shelf, everything covered in dust but preserved, like a shrine. She backed out and closed the door carefully. The 4th room she didn't try. Some things were better left alone. By midday, she was restless enough to brave the cold and feed the chickens like Boone had instructed. The barn was massive, built to house cattle during brutal winters. Most of the stalls were empty now, but she could see where animals had been kept recently. Everything was organized with the same careful attention she'd noticed in the house. Tools hanging on their proper pegs, feed barrels labeled and sealed, tack cleaned and stored correctly. Whoever Boone Mercer was, he wasn't careless. The chickens were in a coop attached to the barn's south side, sheltered from the worst weather. She scattered grain and collected eggs, 8 of them today. Good layers. She remembered her mother explaining once how you could tell the quality of a farm by the health of the chickens. These were well-fed, well-housed birds, not cheap feed and neglect. She was heading back to the house when she heard hoofbeats. For a second, she thought Boone had returned early. Then she realized the sound was coming from the wrong direction, and there were multiple horses. 3 riders appeared through the trees, moving fast. Even from a distance, Lenora could tell they weren't friendly visits. Something about the way they rode, loose and aggressive, scanning the ranch like they were looking for weakness. She ran for the house. The rifle was where Boone said it would be, mounted over the door. She pulled it down with shaking hands, then realized she had no idea if it was loaded or how to check. She told him she couldn't shoot, and now she was alone with strange men approaching and a weapon she couldn't use. The riders pulled up in front of the house. She could see them clearly through the window now, hard-looking men in dusty range clothes, the kind who made a living in ways that didn't involve honest work. The leader was maybe 40, with a scar running from his eye to his jaw and a smile that made Lenora's stomach turn. He dismounted and walked toward the porch like he owned it. Lenora set the rifle against the wall and opened the door before he could knock. Better to meet them outside than let them think she was cowering. "Help you with something?" she asked, trying to sound braver than she felt. The scarred man looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well now, heard Mercer got himself a wife, but I didn't believe it. Thought who'd be crazy enough to marry that cold bastard." He grinned. "Guess you are. My husband isn't here right now. You should come back later." "Oh, we know he ain't here. That's why we came." He stepped closer, and Lenora fought the urge to retreat. "Name's Pike. This here's Jennings and Carter. We got business with Mercer, but since he ain't available, maybe you can help." "I don't know anything about my husband's business." "Sure you don't, but you can give him a message for us." Pike's smile widened. "Tell him the Dalton Creek Range is ours now. He's been letting his cattle wander onto our side of the boundary, and we don't appreciate it. Next time we find Mercer's stock on our land, we're keeping them. You understand?" Lenora understood that Boone had mentioned checking cattle on the North Ridge, and these men were claiming territory that probably wasn't theirs. Range disputes could turn bloody fast. "I'll tell him," she said. "You do that." Pike didn't move. "Must get lonely up here, just you and Mercer. He treat you right?" The question made her blood run cold. "That's none of your concern. I'm just saying, a pretty thing like you stuck up here with a man like that." Pike glanced back at his companions, who'd spread out like wolves circling prey. "If you ever need company, we're just over the ridge. Be happy to show you some hospitality." Lenora's hand found the door frame, gripping it hard enough to hurt. "You need to leave." We're leaving." But Pike made no move toward his horse. Instead, he looked past her into the house. "Nice place Mercer's got here. Heard he built it himself after his first wife died. That true?" "I wouldn't know. Heard she died screaming. Her and the boy both, trapped in a snowstorm while Mercer was out drinking." Pike's eyes came back to her, sharp and mean. "Heard he came home and found them frozen solid. Some folks say that's what made him the way he is, cold inside as they were outside." "Get off this property," Lenora said, her voice shaking now. "Get off before I get—" "Before you what?" Pike laughed. "Shoot us with that rifle you don't know how to load? We saw you grab it. Saw you standing at the window, looking scared." He stepped onto the porch, close enough that she could smell tobacco and sweat. "Here's another message for your husband. Tell him his borders are shrinking. Tell him the days of Boone Mercer running this territory like his own kingdom are over. And tell him if he's got a problem with that, he can come find us himself instead of hiding behind his new bride." He reached out like he was going to touch her face. The rifle shot split the air like thunder. All 4 of them froze. Then Pike's hat flew off his head. A neat hole punched through the crown. He dropped to the ground, scrambling for cover, and his men went for their guns. "Next one goes through your skull instead of over it." Boone's voice came from somewhere in the trees. Lenora couldn't see him, but apparently Pike and his men could because they stopped reaching for weapons real quick. "Mercer!" Pike said, trying to salvage some dignity while crouched behind his horse. Was just delivering a message. I heard your message. Boone emerged from the tree line on horseback, rifle balanced across his saddle, pointing at Pike's chest. Now hear mine. You come on my property again without invitation, I'll bury you on it. You threaten my wife again, I'll make sure it takes a long time. And if you're confused about where the boundary line is, I got surveys and territory maps that'll clear it up real fast. We ain't threatened nobody, Jennings called out. Just talking. Funny kind of talking, 3 armed men cornering a woman alone. Boone's horse moved closer, and Lenore could see his face now. Still expressionless, but his eyes had gone from empty to something much worse. Focused, predatory. Pike, you and I both know Dalton Creek Range belongs to the Morrison estate, and has since before either of us was born. You trying to claim it just tells me you're getting desperate. You calling me a liar? I'm calling you a lot of things. Liar's the nicest. Boone shifted the rifle slightly. You're running out of territory because you don't know how to work land properly. You overgraze, you don't manage water, and when things go bad, you try to steal from people who planned better. That about sum it up? Pike's face went red, but he didn't argue. Thought so, Boone continued. Now you got 2 choices. You can mount up and ride out of here, and we'll pretend this was just a misunderstanding between neighbors. Or you can try something stupid, and I'll put holes in all 3 of you before your guns clear leather. I done it before with better men than you. The threat hung in the air. Nobody moved. Clock's ticking, Pike. Pike stood slowly, hands visible and empty. This ain't over, Mercer. Yeah, it is. You just don't know it yet. Boone's rifle didn't waver. Ride. They mounted up and left fast, Pike stopping only long enough to grab his ruined hat from the porch. Boone didn't lower the rifle until they were out of sight, and even then he waited another full minute before dismounting. He tied his horse to the porch rail and walked up the steps to where Lenora still stood frozen. You hurt? He asked. She shook her head. Words wouldn't come. They touch you? No. You came before... Her voice cracked. How did you know? Saw their tracks cutting across my north pasture. Figured they were headed here while I was gone. He took the rifle from where she'd left it leaning against the wall and checked it. This ain't loaded. I know. But you grabbed it anyway. I didn't know what else to do. Something that might have been approval crossed his face. Probably saved your life. They saw you armed. They had to be more careful. Gave me time to get into position. He opened the rifle and started loading it properly. You remember what I said about shooting? Aim for the biggest part and keep pulling the trigger. Good. Now watch. He showed her how to load, how to work the action, how to aim. His hands were steady and patient, treating her like a student instead of an idiot. You don't have to be a good shot. You just have to make them think twice about coming closer. Understand? Lenore nodded. Try it. Load it yourself. She fumbled the first cartridge, but got the second one in correctly. The rifle was heavier than she expected, awkward to hold. Bring it up to your shoulder. Firm grip. Look down the sight. Boone positioned himself behind her, adjusting her stance without actually touching her. See that fence post about 50 yards out? Yes. Aim for it. Breathe out slow and squeeze the trigger. She fired. The recoil nearly knocked her backwards, and the shot went wide, kicking up dirt 20 feet left of the target. Not bad for first time, Boone said. Try again. She fired 4 more times. The last shot actually hit the post, splintering wood with a satisfying crack. There you go, Boone said, taking the rifle back. Practice when you get a chance. Don't need to be perfect, just need to make them think twice. He started to turn away, then stopped. What Pike said. About my wife and son. About me coming home and finding them. You don't have to... He was wrong. I wasn't drinking. I was trying to get through the storm to fetch the doctor. Sarah had taken sick sudden, and Thomas, that was my boy, he was just 3. Too small to fight off what she had. His jaw worked like the words hurt to say. Storm came up fast. By the time I made it back, they were gone. Both of them. But I was there, and I was sober. Lenore didn't know what to say to that. I'm sorry, felt too small. People tell stories, Boone continued. They make you into whatever they need you to be. Monster, drunk. Whatever explains why bad things happened. Truth doesn't matter as much as the story. He met her eyes. So I'm telling you the truth now, because you're going to hear different from other folks. You can believe what you want." "I believe you," she said, and realized she meant it. He nodded once, then carried the rifle inside and returned it to its place over the door. When he came back out, his expression had returned to its usual carefully controlled neutral. "Pike and his men won't come back soon, but they might try again eventually. When I'm not here, you keep that rifle close. You hear horses you don't recognize, you lock yourself inside and don't open the door for anyone but me. Clear?" "Clear?" "Good." He looked toward the barn. "I need to finish checking the north pasture before dark. You'll be all right?" The question surprised her. Yesterday he would have just left. Now he was asking. "I'll be fine," she said. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded and went to his horse. But before mounting, he turned back one more time. "You did good today," he said. "A lot of women would have panicked. You kept your head." It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd ever heard from him. Before she could respond, he was already riding away, disappearing into the trees like a ghost. Lenora stood on the porch until her hands stopped shaking. Then she went inside and made herself tea she didn't drink, staring at the rifle over the door and thinking about the strange man she'd married. He'd killed people. She didn't doubt that for a second. The way he'd threatened Pike wasn't bluffing. It was a promise delivered by someone who'd made good on similar promises before. But he'd also taught her to shoot, had called her good for not falling apart, had told her the truth about his dead family when he could have said nothing. Lenora was starting to realize that Boone Mercer might be exactly as dangerous as everyone said, and exactly as lonely. The question was whether that made things better or worse. She fell asleep that night trying to decide, the rifle's weight still phantom heavy in her arms, and woke before dawn to the smell of coffee that didn't burn and the sound of Boone fixing the porch rail Pike had damaged with his boots. He didn't say good morning when she came downstairs, just poured her coffee and went back to work. But he'd left eggs on the counter next to the stove, already collected from the coop. Lenore made breakfast for both of them without being asked. They were learning each other slowly, carefully, like two wild animals deciding whether to trust the shared territory. It wasn't comfort yet, wasn't safety, but it was something. And something, Lenore was learning, was better than nothing at all. The routine settled over them like snow accumulating on a roof, quiet, gradual, and heavier than either of them acknowledged. Mornings meant coffee before dawn. Lenore would come downstairs to find Boone already dressed, pulling on his boots by the door. He'd pour her a cup without asking if she wanted one, and she'd start breakfast while he checked the animals. They ate in silence mostly, the kind that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. Then he'd leave for whatever work the ranch demanded, and she'd be alone until late afternoon. The days blurred together. She cleaned the house, even though it was already clean. Read books from Boone's collection. He had surprisingly good taste, or maybe just took whatever the general store in Copper Hollow could get. Practiced loading the rifle until her hands stopped shaking when she touched it. Fed the chickens. Collected eggs. Stared out the window at mountains that felt less like protection and more like walls. 3 weeks passed this way. Then 4. The isolation should have driven her crazy. Back home, even with her family's poverty, there had been neighbors close enough to hear if you shouted. Church on Sundays. The occasional social at someone's barn. People. Here there was only Boone, and he barely spoke 10 words a day. But the silence was starting to feel less empty. She noticed things about him that she'd missed at first. The way he favored his left leg on cold mornings, probably an old injury. How he always checked the sky before leaving, reading weather and clouds the way she used to read her mother's moods and facial expressions. The careful way he maintained everything, tools, fences, even the hinges on doors got oiled regularly. And the books. He read every night after dinner, sitting in the chair closest to the fire. Never novels, always technical manuals or agricultural journals. Sometimes he'd read something and grunt, like he was arguing with the author. One night she couldn't help herself. "You disagree with that?" He looked up, surprised she'd spoken. "It says here cattle can't handle elevation above 7,000 feet without losing weight. That's horse shit. My stock's been above 8,000 all summer, and they're fat as November pigs." Maybe the book's wrong. Books from some university professor who's probably never seen a real cow. He went back to reading, then added, "Most of what they teach in schools is guessing dressed up as fact." It was the longest conversation they'd had in days. Where'd you learn ranching? Lenora asked. If not from books. My father. He learned from his father, and before that from trial and a lot of dead cattle. Boone turned a page. Books can teach you theory. Mountains teach you reality. Reality wins every time. Your father still alive? No, died when I was 19. Left me this place in a pile of debt that took 6 years to clear. What about your mother? His expression closed like a door slamming. She's not a topic. Lenore recognized that tone. It was the same one her father used when anyone mentioned her mother after the fever. Some wounds didn't heal, they just scarred over, and you learn not to pick at them. She went back to the coat she was mending, one of Boone's work jackets that had torn on barbed wire. He'd left it draped over a chair like he expected it to mend itself, and she'd started fixing it without asking. Seemed wasteful to let good wool go to ruin. You don't have to do that, Boone said, watching her work. I know. I can sew well enough myself. Then why haven't you? He didn't have an answer for that. She finished the seam and bit off the thread. There. Good as new. Thank you. She started to stand, but he spoke again before she could. You holding up all right? Up here, I mean. It's different from town. The question caught her off guard. I'm managing. That's not what I asked. Lenora set down the coat carefully. What do you want me to say? That I love being isolated in the mountains with a man I don't know? That this is exactly what I dreamed of when I was a girl? No. I want you to tell me the truth. The truth is, I don't know how I'm doing. She met his eyes. Some days I think this is better than I expected. Other days I want to run until I hit the ocean. Most days I just feel nothing at all, which is probably the worst of the three. Boone absorbed that with a slow nod. Fair enough. What about you? The words came out before she could stop them. You holding up all right? He actually smiled. It was small and gone fast, but it had definitely been a smile. Never had someone ask me that before. That's not an answer. I'm managing, he said, throwing her own words back. Then he stood and carried his book toward the stairs. I'll be up early tomorrow. Got to ride to Morrison's place, settle some boundary questions before Pike tries his luck again. I'll probably be gone 2 days. Lenora's stomach dropped. You're leaving me alone for 2 days? You'll be fine. There's food. The rifle's loaded. Morrison's son will swing by tomorrow afternoon to check you got everything you need. I already sent word. You didn't think to ask me first? Boone paused on the bottom step. Ask you what? If you wanted to be safe? Ask me if I wanted a stranger coming by. James Morrison ain't a stranger. He's a decent kid, just turned 20. His father and I have had neighboring land for 15 years. You'll be safer with him checking in than alone for 2 full days. I don't need a babysitter. Didn't say you did. But I need to know you're all right while I'm gone, and Morrison owes me favors. He started up the stairs. He'll come by midday, be polite, offer him coffee, send him home. That's all. Boone, good night, Lenora. She sat alone by the dying fire, angry for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. It wasn't about young Morrison coming to check on her. It was about Boone making decisions without consulting her, like she was a child or property he'd left instructions for. Except he'd also taught her to shoot, given her a locked room, paid off her father's entire debt without asking for anything in return. The man was a walking contradiction, and Lenora was tired of trying to figure him out. She went to bed frustrated and woke to find Boone already gone. A note on the kitchen table in surprisingly neat handwriting. Back Thursday evening, don't forget to feed the chickens. Like she was going to forget the only living thing she saw most days. The first day alone wasn't bad. She actually enjoyed the solitude, the freedom to move through the house without wondering if she was bothering him. She sang while she worked, something she hadn't done since before her mother died. The sound felt strange in the empty rooms, but good too. Evidence she was still alive. Morrison's son showed up exactly when Boone said he would, riding a spotted mare and looking uncomfortable about his errand. Mrs. Mercer, he said, hat in hands, when she opened the door. I'm James Morrison. Your husband asked me to... I know. Come in. I'll get you coffee. He was younger than she'd expected, with the kind of open face that probably couldn't hide a lie if his life depended on it. Tall and gangly, like he hadn't quite grown into his height yet. You don't have to trouble yourself, James said, hovering in the doorway, like he was afraid to come inside. It's not trouble. Sit. He sat at the kitchen table like it might bite him. Lenora poured coffee and set out some of the bread she'd baked that morning. He took both gratefully. "Your husband wanted me to make sure you had everything you needed," James said between sips, "and to check if there's been any trouble." "No trouble." "You sure? Pike and his boys have been stirring up problems all over the territory. My father thinks they're getting desperate." "Pike was here a few weeks ago. Boone sent them away." "I heard about that," James grinned. "Heard he shot Pike's hat clean off his head. Wish I could have seen it. It was terrifying." "Oh, right. Sorry." His grin faded. "Must have been scary, them coming around when you were alone." "I managed." They sat in awkward silence for a moment. James seemed like he was working up courage for something. "Can I ask you something, Mrs. Mercer?" "Lenora. And I guess? Boone, is he treating you all right?" James looked genuinely concerned. "Because my father said if you ever needed help or a place to stay or anything..." Lenora felt something warm spread through her chest. This boy didn't know her at all, but he was offering help anyway. "That's kind, but I'm fine. Really. Because the stories people tell about him are mostly wrong," she interrupted. "Boone's not what people think." James looked skeptical but didn't push. "If you say so." After he left, Lenora stood on the porch watching him ride away and wondered what stories Copper Hollow was telling about her marriage. Probably nothing good. Poor Lenora Whitfield, sold to the mountain monster. They were probably taking bets on how long until he killed her or drove her mad. The thought made her angry enough that she spent the rest of the afternoon chopping wood she didn't need, just to have something to hit. That night the house felt too quiet. She made dinner for one, which felt depressing, so she didn't eat much. Sat by the fire with one of Boone's books, but couldn't concentrate. Went to bed early and couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what James had asked. "Is he treating you all right?" The answer should have been simple, but it wasn't. Boone gave her space, freedom, safety. He'd protected her from Pike, taught her to shoot, never demanded anything she wasn't willing to give. But he also barely talked to her, kept her at arm's length emotionally, made decisions without input, left for days without seeming to care if she minded. Was that treating her all right? Or was it just a different kind of neglect? She was still wrestling with the question when she finally fell asleep, and her dreams were full of locked doors and empty eyes and mountains that never ended. The second day dragged. She tried to stay busy, but there was only so much cleaning an already clean house could take. By afternoon, she was so restless she decided to explore beyond the immediate ranch buildings. She took the rifle, Boone would kill her if she went wandering unarmed, and walked toward the north pasture. The cattle were there, massive shapes moving slowly across brown grass. They ignored her completely. Beyond the pasture, the forest thickened. Lenora followed a game trail that wound between pines, enjoying the silence and the smell of sap and earth. She'd gone maybe a quarter mile when she found it. A small graveyard carved into a clearing. 2 headstones, simple wood markers weathered by years of mountain weather. She approached slowly, feeling like an intruder. Sarah Mercer. Born 1842, died 1867. Beloved wife and mother. Thomas Mercer. Born 1864, died 1867. Our little light. Lenora stood there for a long time, staring at the graves of the family Boone had lost. The wife Pike had lied about. The son who'd only lived 3 years. Someone had been maintaining this place. The graves were clear of debris, the ground around them free of weeds. Fresh pine boughs lay across both markers, recently placed. Boone came here, probably often. She thought about the empty rooms in the house, the child's toys preserved in dust, the way Boone's face went carefully blank whenever anything touched too close to the past. He wasn't cold inside because he'd been born that way. He was cold because he'd frozen himself to survive losing everything that mattered. Lenora felt something shift in her chest. Not quite sympathy, she'd had her own losses, and sympathy always felt patronizing, but understanding maybe. Recognition. They were both just trying to survive what life had taken from them. She left the graveyard quietly and walked back to the house as afternoon faded to evening, made herself dinner, fed the chickens, cleaned the rifle, and returned it to its place. When Boone came home the next afternoon, she was in the kitchen making stew. He stopped in the doorway like he'd expected to find the house empty. "You're here. Where else would I be?" "I don't know, just..." He set down his saddlebags. Morrison's boy came by? Yesterday. He was polite. Good. Boone hung up his coat. Everything go all right while I was gone? Fine. No problems. He nodded but didn't move, just stood there looking uncomfortable. Finally he said, I should have asked before arranging for James to check on you. That was wrong. The apology surprised her. It's fine. No, it ain't. You're not a child. I shouldn't have treated you like one. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself. I'm not good at this. Having someone here, having to think about what another person needs or wants. I've been alone too long. I found the graves, Lenora said quietly. Boone went very still. You went to the north clearing. I didn't mean to intrude. I was just walking and it's your land too now. You can go where you want. But his voice had gone tight. What about them? Nothing. Just that I understand better now. Why you are the way you are. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something raw flash across his face before he could hide it. You don't understand anything. Maybe not, but I'm trying to. Why? The question hung between them. Why was she trying? Why did it matter? She was stuck here regardless. Understanding Boone Mercer wouldn't change her circumstances, but it might change how she felt about them. Because we're living in the same house, she said finally. Because you're the only person I see most days. Because I'm tired of feeling like I'm sharing space with a ghost. Maybe that's all I am. No. Ghosts don't chop wood or fix fences or teach women to shoot. She stirred the stew harder than necessary. Ghosts don't maintain graves or read books or get angry when professors are wrong about cattle. You're alive, Boone. You're just pretending not to be. She expected him to get angry, expected him to shut down or walk away like he always did when conversations went too deep. Instead, he sat down at the table heavily, like his legs had given out. You're right, he said quietly. I've been pretending for 7 years. Easier that way. Doesn't hurt as much. Lenora turned from the stove. This was the most honest he'd ever been with her. After they died, Boone continued staring at his hands. I thought about leaving, selling the ranch, going somewhere new, starting over where nobody knew what I'd lost. But I couldn't do it. This place has their bones in it. Leaving felt like abandoning them all over again. So you stayed and turned yourself into stone. Something like that. He finally looked up at her. Then your father's debt came up, and the broker made his offer, and I thought maybe, I don't know what I thought, that having someone here might make the house feel less empty, that I could help your family and fix my own loneliness at the same time. Stupid, not stupid, sad maybe. I didn't know you'd been forced into it, he said. Not until we were already married and I saw your face at the altar. You looked terrified, like I'd bought you at auction. You did buy me. $3,000. I paid a debt. That's different. Is it? Boone was quiet for a long time. I want it to be, he finally said. I want there to be a difference between what I did and what Pike would have done. But maybe there ain't. Maybe I'm just a different kind of monster. Lenora sat down across from him. The stew would keep. This conversation felt more important than food. You're not a monster, she said. You're just lonely. And I'm just trying to figure out if I can live with that. Live with me being lonely? Live with being lonely myself. She met his eyes. Because that's what this is, isn't it? Both of us stuck up here, trapped by different things. You by grief, me by debt, and neither of us knows how to be anything other than alone anymore. He didn't deny it. They sat in silence while the stew bubbled on the stove and the light outside faded to dusk. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound made Lenora shiver, but not from fear, from recognition. She understood that sound, that loneliness calling out to the dark, hoping something would answer. I don't want to be alone anymore, she said. I'm tired of it. Boone's jaw tightened. What do you want me to do about that? Talk to me. Actually talk, not just give orders or state facts. Tell me things, ask me things, be a person instead of a mountain. I don't know if I remember how. Then learn again. She reached across the table and did something she'd never done before, touched his hand deliberately. His skin was rough, calloused from years of hard work. We're both stuck here, Boone. We can keep pretending we're alone, or we can try to be less alone together. Your choice. He looked at her hand on his like it was a wild animal that might bite. But he didn't pull away. What if I hurt you? He asked quietly. What if I hurt you? You can't. Yes, I can. I'm already doing it. Lenora pulled her hand back slowly. Every time I lock my door, every time I flinch when you move too fast, every time I look at you like you're something to fear instead of someone to know, I'm hurting you by treating you like the monster everyone says you are. Boone's expression cracked, just for a second, and she saw the wounded man underneath. Maybe I deserve it. Maybe we both deserve better than what we got. The stew started to boil over. Lenora jumped up to save it, and the moment broke. But something had shifted between them. Some wall had developed a crack. They ate dinner together, and for the first time, Boone asked her questions. Where had she grown up? What had her mother been like? Did she miss Copper Hollow? His questions were awkward, like he was out of practice with conversation. But he was trying, and Lenora found herself answering honestly, telling him about her mother's garden and her brother's constant fighting, and how she used to read penny novels by candlelight when she was supposed to be sleeping. What kind of novels? Boone asked. Adventures mostly. Stories about women who saved themselves instead of waiting for rescue. She smiled slightly. My mother hated them, said they'd give me unrealistic ideas about life. Were they unrealistic? Completely. Life's nothing like those stories, she paused. But I still like them. Still like them, I guess. There's a few novels on the shelf. Help yourself to whatever you want. I've been reading your agricultural manuals. That surprised him. Why? Because they were there, and because I wanted to understand what you do all day. He didn't respond, but something softened in his expression. After dinner, he didn't disappear to his room immediately. Instead, he built up the fire and settled into his usual chair with a book. Lenora took the chair opposite with one of the novels he'd mentioned, a battered copy of something involving pirates. They read in silence, but it was different than before. Less empty. Around 9, Boone set down his book and stood. I'm heading up. You need anything before I go? No, I'm fine. He nodded and started for the stairs, then stopped. Lenora? Yes? Thank you for today. For trying. He was gone before she could respond, his boots heavy on the stairs, his door closing with a soft click. Lenora sat by the fire until it burned down to embers, thinking about graves and clearings, and hands that didn't pull away, and the 1,000 small ways people tried to survive their own loneliness. When she finally went upstairs, she didn't lock her door. It was a small thing, probably stupid, but it felt like something, and Boone, lying awake in his own room, heard the lock not click and felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years. Hope. Dangerous, foolish hope, but hope nonetheless. The unlocked door changed things faster than either of them expected. Not dramatically. Boone didn't suddenly become talkative, and Lenora didn't stop jumping when he moved too quickly in her peripheral vision. But small shifts accumulated like water wearing down stone. He started asking what she wanted for dinner instead of assuming. She stopped retreating to her room the moment they finished eating. They were learning to exist in the same space without both of them holding their breath. Then November hit hard, bringing the kind of cold that cracked tree branches and turned morning water buckets to solid ice. Boone spent longer hours preparing the ranch for winter, reinforcing the barn, stockpiling firewood, moving cattle to lower pastures where they'd have better shelter. Lenora watched him work himself to exhaustion every day and started leaving hot coffee on the porch railing where he'd find it. He never thanked her directly, but the empty cups always appeared washed and returned to their hooks by morning. 2 weeks before the first real snow, Boone came back from town with supplies and news that made his jaw tight. There's a church social on Sunday, he said, unloading flour and coffee from the wagon. Mrs. Henderson made a point of telling me 3 times that we're expected. Lenora's stomach dropped. She hadn't been back to Copper Hollow since the wedding. The thought of facing those people, their pity, their judgment, their whispered stories, made her want to lock herself in her room and never come out. Do we have to go? She asked. Technically, no. Practically, yes. He hauled a sack of grain toward the barn. We don't show, they'll talk. We do show, they'll talk. Least if we're there, they have to say it to our faces. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, but it's true. He stopped and looked at her properly. You don't have to come if you don't want to. I can make an excuse. What excuse? I'll think of something. Say you're sick. Say the ranch needs tending. Say whatever keeps them from thinking I'm locking you up here. Which they probably already thought. Lenora could imagine the gossip. Poor girl, trapped with that mountain man, probably half dead from mistreatment. I'll go, she said, hating every word. But I'm not wearing that borrowed dress again. You got something else? No. Everything I own is either work clothes or worn through. Boone set down the grain sack and pulled a package from the wagon bed. Brown paper, tied with string. He handed it to her like it might explode. What's this? Open it. She untied the string carefully. Inside was fabric, good fabric, deep green wool that felt expensive under her fingers. Enough for a dress, plus some kind of cream-colored material for trim. When did you... Ordered it 3 weeks ago from the catalog. Mrs. Henderson helped with sizing based on that dress you wore to the wedding. He was already turning away, uncomfortable with her staring. Figured you'd need something decent eventually. If it don't fit, we can exchange it. Lenora stood holding the fabric, completely lost for words. This wasn't just practical. He'd thought about color, about what would suit her. The green would bring out her eyes. The cream would soften the overall look. Boone, it's just fabric. Don't make it into something it ain't. But his ears had gone red, which was the closest to embarrassed she'd ever seen him. Thank you, she said quietly. He grunted and went back to unloading supplies like the conversation hadn't happened. Lenora spent the next 3 days sewing the dress, working by the fire in the evenings while Boone pretended to read. Her stitching wasn't as fine as her mother's had been, but it was competent. The dress came together piece by piece, bodice, skirt, sleeves with the cream trim at the cuffs. When she tried it on Friday evening, it fit perfectly. She came down the stairs feeling self-conscious and strange. She hadn't worn anything this nice since before her mother died. Boone looked up from his book, and whatever he'd been about to say died on his lips. It's good? Lenora asked, suddenly worried. It looks all right? You look... He stopped, cleared his throat. The dress fits well. Which wasn't what he'd started to say, but Lenora didn't push. Sunday morning arrived cold and gray. They left early, the wagon ride to Copper Hollow taking nearly 2 hours over frozen roads. Lenora's anxiety grew with every mile. She twisted the wedding ring on her finger, still too big, still wrapped with thread to keep it on, and tried to imagine walking into that church. You're nervous, Boone observed. Obviously. They're just people. People who watched my father sell me like livestock. Then they should be the ones feeling ashamed, not you. He snapped the reins, moving the horses slightly faster. You didn't do anything wrong, Lenora. Remember that. Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one who'd been traded away for $3,000. Copper Hollow looked the same as she remembered. Small, rough, clinging to existence through sheer stubborn will. The church sat at the end of the main street, people already gathering outside in their Sunday clothes. Conversation stopped when Boone's wagon appeared. Everyone turned to stare as he pulled up and set the brake. Lenore could feel their eyes crawling over her, looking for evidence of abuse or madness or whatever they'd convinced themselves must be happening at Mercer Ridge. Boone climbed down and offered his hand. She took it, letting him help her down, and heard the whispers start immediately. Did you see that dress? Where'd she get something that fine? Probably his way of apologizing for whatever he does to her up there. Poor thing looks half-starved. Lenora wasn't starved. She'd actually gained weight since the wedding, eating regular meals instead of the scraps her family had survived on. But facts didn't matter when people wanted a story. Mrs. Henderson bustled over, all false sympathy and hungry curiosity. Lenora dear, how wonderful to see you. We've been so worried. No need to worry, Lenora said, forcing a smile. I'm fine. Of course you are. And that dress is lovely. Did you make it yourself? Yes. Such a talented seamstress. Your mother would be proud. Mrs. Henderson's eyes shifted to Boone, who stood like a wall beside Lenora. Mr. Mercer, good of you to bring her to socialize. She must get so lonely up at that ranch. She manages, Boone said flatly. I'm sure she does. But Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested she thought otherwise. More people drifted over, some genuinely kind, others just nosy. Jacob Porter showed up looking guilty and couldn't meet Lenora's eyes. Her father was notably absent, probably too ashamed to face her. Then the wealthy families arrived. The Carsons, the Daltons, the Pritchards who owned half the businesses in town. Women in expensive dresses that cost more than most families earned in 6 months. Men who treated Copper Hollow like their private kingdom. Evelyn Carson spotted Lenora and came over with her usual entourage, all of them looking like they'd smelled something rotten. "Well, well," Evelyn said, voice dripping false sweetness. "The bride returns. We were starting to think Mercer had you chained in the basement." Her friends laughed like this was hilarious. "No chains," Lenora said evenly. "Just winter preparations." How industrious. Evelyn's eyes traveled over Lenora's dress with obvious disdain. "That's a lovely color. Very practical." The implication was clear. Practical meant cheap, meant rustic, meant not good enough for proper society. "Thank you," Lenora said. "My husband chose the fabric." That caused a ripple of surprise. Apparently they hadn't expected Boone to have opinions about women's clothing. "How domestic," Evelyn continued, but her smile had sharpened. "Though I suppose when you're bought and paid for, you wear whatever your owner provides." The words hit like a slap. Around them, people had gone quiet, waiting to see how Lenora would react. Boone moved forward slightly, positioning himself between Lenora and Evelyn. "Watch your mouth," he said quietly. "Or what?" Evelyn's father, Richard Carson, stepped up beside his daughter. "You'll threaten respectable citizens in front of the church? We're not Pike and his raiders, Mercer. You can't just shoot our hats off." "Don't tempt me." The tension ratcheted up immediately. Men started positioning themselves, choosing sides without even realizing it. Lenora could see this spinning into violence fast. "Stop," she said, loud enough to cut through the rising hostility. "Everyone just stop." She stepped around Boone, facing Evelyn and the Carson family directly. Her heart was hammering, but she kept her voice steady. "You want to talk about being bought? Let's talk about it." Lenora looked around at all the watching faces. "My father owed money he couldn't pay, a debt that would have destroyed my entire family. Boone offered to clear it in exchange for marriage. So yes, technically, I was traded. A transaction. Just like half the marriages in this town, if we're being honest." Evelyn started to interrupt, but Lenora kept going. "The difference is, Boone gave me a choice. Gave me land in my own name. Gave me freedom to leave whenever I want. How many of you can say your husbands did the same?" She looked directly at Evelyn. "Your father arranged your marriage to Thomas Pritchard when you were 17. You cried for 3 days. Everyone in town knew you loved someone else." Evelyn went pale. "And you?" Lenora turned to Mrs. Carson. "Married Richard because your family was going bankrupt. You were 19, he was 45. That's not love, that's survival." Richard Carson's face went purple. "How dare you?" "I dare because you started this." Lenora's voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. "You want to judge me for being poor? For doing what I had to do to save my family? Fine, judge away. But don't pretend you're better than me. Don't pretend your marriages are somehow more pure or more real." The silence that followed was absolute. Then someone in the back, she couldn't see who, started clapping. Slowly at first, then joined by others. Not everyone, but enough. James Morrison was grinning. Mrs. Henderson looked stunned. Even some of the wealthier families seemed taken aback by Lenora's nerve. But the Carsons looked furious. "You've just made a powerful enemy," Richard Carson said coldly. "My family has influence in this territory. We could make life very difficult for you and your husband." "Try it," Boone said, stepping up beside Lenora again. "My lawyers are better than yours. My land titles are older, and I know where all your boundary violations are. You want a war, Carson, you'll lose." "We'll see about that." Richard grabbed Evelyn's arm and stalked toward the church. His wife and friends followed, shooting poison looks over their shoulders. The crowd started dispersing, buzzing with gossip. This would be the talk of Copper Hollow for months. Mrs. Henderson approached cautiously. "That was either very brave or very stupid, dear." "Probably both," Lenora admitted. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "Well, stupid or not, someone needed to say it." Mrs. Henderson patted her arm. "Half this town trades daughters like cattle, and then acts shocked when someone's honest about it. You did good." After she left, Lenora and Boone stood alone near the wagon. You didn't have to defend me, he said quietly. Yes, I did. They were calling you a slaver. I've been called worse. Maybe, but not while I'm standing there. She looked at him. You're my husband. Whatever else is or isn't true about this arrangement, that part is real, and I won't let people insult you. Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or something deeper. You meant what you said about having freedom to leave? You told me I could that first night. And you believed me? Eventually. She pulled her shawl tighter against the cold. Can we go home now? I don't think I can handle actually sitting through the social. Yeah, we're done here. They climbed back into the wagon and left Copper Hollow behind, neither of them speaking for the first hour of the ride. The adrenaline wore off gradually, leaving Lenora exhausted and second-guessing everything she'd said. Did I make things worse? She asked finally. For the Carsons? Definitely. I mean for us. For you. Boone considered that. Richard Carson's been looking for an excuse to come after my land for years. You probably just accelerated his timeline. But we would have ended up here eventually. So I started a war. No, you just stopped pretending there wasn't one already. He glanced at her. What you said about the marriages in town, that true? About Evelyn Carson? Most of it. Some I guessed, but it wasn't hard. Everyone knows the wealthy families trade daughters for alliances. But you made it personal, used their own hypocrisy against them. Was that wrong? No, it was smart. He almost smiled. Reminded me of something Sarah would have done. She never could stand hypocrites either. It was the first time he'd mentioned his dead wife casually, without the usual careful walls around the topic. Lenora decided not to make a big deal about it. What was she like? She asked instead. Boone was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, fierce, stubborn as winter. She grew up on a ranch smaller than ours, knew how to work hard and didn't complain about it. We fought constantly about stupid things, but she made me laugh more than anyone I've ever known. How'd you meet? Her father's ranch bordered ours. She used to ride over and argue with my father about water rights. I was 19. She was 17. Thought she was the most aggravating woman alive. His jaw worked. Married her 6 months later. And Thomas? He was exactly like her. Loud, stubborn, fearless. Drove me crazy half the time and made me want to be better the other half. Boone's hands tightened on the reins. Losing them was like losing pieces of myself, the good pieces. You still have good pieces, Lenora said quietly. That's generous. It's true. You think monsters teach women to shoot? Or choose fabric that matches their eyes? Or stand up to rich families they could just ignore? I didn't do any of that for noble reasons. Maybe not. But you did them anyway. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels crunching over frozen ground. Snow had started falling, light flurries that wouldn't amount to much but promised harder weather coming. Thank you, Boone said eventually, for defending me back there. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. We're in this together, whether we planned it or not. She looked at him. That's what you said, isn't it? That you wanted a partner? I said a lot of stupid things when I was trying to justify paying your father's debt. Doesn't make them less true. He didn't argue with that. They got home just before dark. Boone unhitched the horses while Lenora started dinner, both of them falling into the routine they'd developed. But something felt different now. The air between them was charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. After dinner, Boone built up the fire while Lenora changed out of the green dress and back into her regular clothes. When she came back downstairs, he was standing at the window, staring out at the snow-covered mountains. Carson's going to make good on his threat, he said without turning around. He'll try to find ways to hurt us. Legally, probably. Maybe try to get territory officials involved, claim boundary disputes or water rights violations. Can he win? Not if I fight back, but fighting takes time and money and energy. He turned to face her. I'm giving you one more chance to leave. You can take the land I signed over, sell it, use the money to start somewhere new, away from all this. Lenora sat down in her chair by the fire. Is that what you want? What I want doesn't matter. Yes, it does. Do you want me to leave? The question hung in the air between them, heavier than all the words that had come before. No, Boone said finally, but I don't want you trapped here because you think you don't have options. I have options. I'm choosing to stay. Why? Because I'm tired of running, I'm tired of being afraid, and I'm tired of being alone. She met his eyes. You said you wanted a partner, someone to build a life with. Well, that's what I want too. Not because I owe you, not because I'm trapped, but because I'm choosing it. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're stubborn and silent and terrible at cooking eggs. I know you read agricultural manuals like other people read novels. I know you maintain graves nobody sees and teach women to shoot even when you'd rather avoid them completely. She stood up and crossed the room to where he stood. I know you're lonely, Boone, just like me, and I think maybe we could be less lonely together. He looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. You're talking about making this real, actually being married, not just legally. Is that so impossible? I don't know how to do that anymore. I don't know how to let someone in without being terrified I'll lose them again. Then we'll figure it out together. She took his hand carefully, the way she had at the dinner table weeks ago. I'm not Sarah. I'll never be Sarah. But maybe I can be someone you don't have to survive alone with. Boone's fingers tightened around hers, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. Not of threats or violence, or even death, but of hope. Of wanting something enough that losing it would destroy him all over again. I can't promise I won't hurt you, he said roughly. I'm not good at this, at feelings or talking or any of it. I can't promise that either. We'll probably hurt each other plenty. She smiled slightly. But maybe we can also help each other, even just a little. He pulled her closer slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he wrapped his arms around her carefully, like she might shatter. She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of another human being for the first time in months. They stood like that for a long time, neither of them speaking, just holding on to each other while the fire crackled and the snow fell outside. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to perfect. But it was real. And real was enough. When they finally separated, Boone's eyes were suspiciously bright. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted. Me neither. What if I mess this up? Then we'll fix it. Or we won't. But at least we'll have tried. He nodded slowly, like he was trying to convince himself this was possible. Then he did something that shocked her. He smiled. A real smile, not the ghost of one. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less haunted. All right, he said. Let's try. That night, Lenora left her door open deliberately. Not an invitation, just a statement. We're doing this. We're actually trying. Boone noticed she heard him pause in the hallway on his way to his own room, but he didn't say anything. They were learning to speak in the language of unlocked doors and chosen fabric and hands that didn't pull away. It was slow and awkward and terrifying for both of them, but it was theirs. And for two people who'd spent so long alone in their separate kinds of darkness, even the smallest light was worth protecting. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing Mercer Ridge in white. The mountains stood sentinel around them, walls that kept the world away. But inside, something fragile and new was beginning to grow. Something that looked a lot like hope. Winter hit Mercer Ridge like a fist 3 days after the church social. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, and snow that had been falling gently turned vicious. Boone was up before dawn checking the animals, making sure nothing would freeze. Lenora woke to find him already gone and coffee made, a note on the table in his rough handwriting. Storm coming, stay inside. She ignored the note. By the time he came back from the barn, she'd already fed the chickens and collected eggs, her fingers numb despite thick gloves. I told you to stay inside, he said, brushing snow from his coat. And I don't take orders well. You should know that by now. He looked like he wanted to argue, then just shook his head. You're going to freeze your hands off being stubborn. Then teach me how to do it without freezing. So he did. Showed her how to layer properly, how to move fast and efficient in the cold, how to read weather signs in the clouds and wind. They worked together preparing for the storm, reinforcing the chicken coop, stacking extra firewood on the porch, checking fence lines for weak spots. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days of being trapped inside together with nowhere to hide. At first it was awkward, too much proximity, too much forced interaction. But by the second day they'd fallen into a rhythm. Boone would read while Lenora sewed or mended. She'd cook while he maintained equipment that needed fixing. They'd play chess in the evenings, a board he pulled from somewhere upstairs. He was terrible at chess. She beat him 7 games in a row. "You're letting me win," she accused on the 8th game. "I'm not. You're just better at strategy." "Liar. You run a cattle ranch. Strategy is your entire job." "Different kind of strategy." He moved his knight into an obvious trap. "Cattle don't plan 3 moves ahead." She took his knight. "Stop playing down to me. I want to win honestly or not at all." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe. The next game he actually tried, and she still won, but it was closer. By the 10th game, he'd figured out her patterns and checkmated her in 20 moves. "There," she said, satisfied. "That's better." "You like losing?" "I like knowing you're not treating me like I'm fragile." The storm broke on the 5th day, leaving 3 feet of snow and a landscape transformed. Everything was white and pristine and deadly beautiful, the kind of beauty that could kill you if you weren't careful. They dug out together, clearing paths to the barn and outbuildings. Hard work that left them both exhausted, but also settled something between them. They were a team now, working toward the same goals. That night, Boone built up the fire and they sat closer than usual, warming cold hands and feet. "Can I ask you something?" Lenora said. "Why'd you really pay my father's debt? The real reason, not the one you told yourself." He was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "I was tired of ghosts. This house had too many of them. Every room, every corner, something reminding me what I'd lost. I thought maybe bringing someone new in would make it feel less like a tomb." "That's honest. You asked for honest." "And now? Does it still feel like a tomb?" He looked at her then, really looked at her. "No. Now it feels like something else, something I don't have a name for yet." "Home, maybe?" "Maybe." He reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. It was the most deliberately intimate thing he'd done since their conversation after the social. "I'm glad you stayed. Even when I told you to leave, I was glad you didn't." "I know." "How?" "Because I'm glad I stayed too. Even when it's hard. Even when we don't know what we're doing." She squeezed his hand. "We're figuring it out." They sat like that until the fire burned low, hands clasped, not talking, just being together in the quiet. Progress came in inches, not miles. But it came. 2 weeks later, a rider appeared through the snow. Lenora saw him from the kitchen window and grabbed the rifle instinctively. "Boone!" He came from the barn fast, his own rifle already in hand. Then he relaxed slightly. "It's Morrison." James Morrison's father dismounted slowly, hands visible. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with kind eyes and the look of someone who'd spent his life solving other people's problems. "David," Boone said, lowering his rifle. "This a social call or trouble?" "Bit of both." Morrison glanced at Lenora in the doorway. "Ma'am, good to see you looking well. Mr. Morrison, come inside, it's freezing." Over coffee, Morrison explained. Richard Carson had filed complaints with the Territory Land Office, claiming Boone's cattle had damaged Carson property and demanding compensation. He'd also started rumors that Boone was mistreating his wife, hoping to get territorial authorities involved in the domestic situation. "It's all garbage," Morrison said bluntly. "Everyone knows it. But Carson's got money and connections. He's making noise loud enough that someone's eventually going to have to investigate." "Let them investigate," Boone said. "They won't find anything." "That's not the point. The point is Carson's trying to drag you through legal mud until you give up or go broke fighting him." "I've got lawyers." "He's got better ones. And more of them." Morrison set down his cup. "Look, Boone, I'm not here to tell you to back down. I'm here to tell you there's another way." "I'm listening." Territory Land Commission meets in Denver next month. They're reviewing boundary disputes and settling grazing rights for the whole region. If you show up with proper documentation, surveys, historical records, witness testimony, you can get your boundaries officially recognized. Carson can file all the complaints he wants, but if the commission rules in your favor, he's got no legal ground to stand on. That's 3 weeks' travel in winter conditions, each direction. "I know, but it's your best shot at ending this permanently." Morrison looked at Lenora. "You'd have to come too. They'll want to interview you, make sure the domestic concerns are unfounded." Lenora felt her stomach drop. A room full of officials asking invasive questions about her marriage sounded like a nightmare. She doesn't have to do anything, Boone said immediately. Actually, I do. Lenora met Morrison's eyes. If they're going to investigate anyway, better to face it head on than let Carson control the narrative. I'll go. Lenora said, I said I'll go. We do this together or not at all, remember? Boone looked like he wanted to argue, but Morrison was nodding approvingly. That's settled then. I'm heading to Denver myself for ranch business. We can travel together, safety in numbers. Leave in 3 days if you can be ready. After Morrison left, Boone paced the kitchen like a caged animal. You don't have to do this, he said for the third time. Yes, I do. They're going to ask personal questions. About our marriage, about whether I've hurt you, about whether you're here willingly. Then I'll answer them, honestly. And what are you going to say? Lenora stopped him mid-pace. The truth. That you paid my father's debt. That you gave me my own room and my own land. That you taught me to shoot and to survive winters and to beat you at chess. That you're stubborn and silent and frustrating as hell, but you've never once treated me like property. That might not be enough for them. Then we'll make it enough. She grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. I'm not afraid of Richard Carson, or his lawyers, or some territorial officials. I'm done being afraid of what people think about me. Something in his expression cracked. When did you get so brave? I've always been brave, I just forgot for a while. She smiled slightly. You helped me remember. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Boone pulled out old surveys and land documents his father had kept, organized everything with meticulous care. Lenora packed practical clothes and the green dress, because she'd learned that sometimes appearances mattered whether you liked it or not. The night before they left, she found Boone in his office, surrounded by papers and looking overwhelmed. What's wrong? She asked. I keep thinking about all the ways this could go bad. Carson's lawyers finding some loophole. The commission deciding in his favor because he's got money and I don't. Them deciding you're not here willingly and forcing an annulment. He rubbed his face tiredly. I keep thinking about losing everything again. Lenora sat down across from him. You won't lose me. Not to Richard Carson, not to some bureaucrats in Denver. I'm here because I choose to be. Nobody can take that away. They could if they declare the marriage invalid. Valid. Then we'll get married again, properly this time, with me actually wanting it instead of just surviving it. The words hung in the air between them, bigger than she'd intended. You'd marry me again? Boone asked quietly. Knowing what you know now? Yes, because now it would be my choice. No debt, no pressure, just us. He came around the desk and pulled her up into a kiss that was desperate and gentle at the same time. Not their first kiss. They'd shared a few awkward attempts over the past weeks, but the first one that felt like it meant something beyond just going through the motions. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. If we get through this, Boone said, I'm doing it right. Proper proposal, proper wedding, the whole thing. You don't have to. Yeah, I do, because you deserve better than what you got the first time. They left at dawn with Morrison and 2 of his ranch hands, traveling in a wagon train that could handle the mountain passes in winter. The journey was brutal, freezing temperatures, dangerous roads. One night camped in a cave when a blizzard made travel impossible. But they made it to Denver with 2 days to spare before the Land Commission hearing. The territorial offices were intimidating, all dark wood and serious men in expensive suits. Richard Carson was already there with 3 lawyers, looking smug and confident. The hearing took 6 hours. Carson's lawyers presented their case, disputed boundaries, alleged property damage, claims that Boone was an irresponsible rancher who let his cattle destroy neighboring land. They made him sound like a barely civilized mountain man who couldn't be trusted to manage his own affairs. Then they brought up Lenora. We have concerns about the circumstances of Mr. Mercer's marriage, Carson's lead lawyer said smoothly. Evidence suggests the union was coerced, that Miss Mrs. Mercer, was essentially purchased to satisfy a debt. The commission members shifted uncomfortably. We'd like to interview Mrs. Mercer privately, the lawyer continued, to ensure she's not being influenced or threatened. Boone looked ready to explode, but Lenora squeezed his hand under the table. I'll answer any questions, she said clearly. You don't need to do it privately. I have nothing to hide. The commission chairman, a gray-haired man named Wallace, nodded. Very well, Mrs. Mercer, can you explain the circumstances of your marriage? Lenora stood, smoothed her green dress, and told them everything. The debt, the arrangement, the wedding where she'd whispered, "I do," while her whole world collapsed. She didn't soften it or make it sound better than it was. Then she told them what came after. The locked door, the land deed in her name, learning to shoot, to survive, to stand up for herself. The slow transformation from transaction to partnership. "Mr. Carson's lawyer is right," she said finally. "I was essentially purchased to satisfy a debt. That's the ugly truth, and I won't deny it. But what happened after isn't what anyone expected. My husband gave me freedom when he could have demanded obedience. He gave me respect when he could have demanded submission. He gave me a choice when he could have kept me trapped." She looked directly at Carson, who was glaring at her with pure hatred. "You want to know if I'm here willingly? I'm here. Sitting in this room, defending my husband and our land against a rich man who thinks money gives him the right to destroy people. That answer your question?" The room went silent. Carson's lawyer tried to recover. "Mrs. Mercer, isn't it possible you've been conditioned to defend your husband? That you've rationalized your captivity?" "No, it's possible I have learned the difference between being owned and being valued. You should try it sometime." Morrison coughed to hide a laugh. Even Wallace looked like he was fighting a smile. The commission deliberated for 2 hours while everyone waited in tense silence. When they returned, Wallace's expression was neutral. "This commission has reviewed all evidence and testimony regarding the disputed land boundaries between the Mercer and Carson properties," he began. "We find that Mr. Mercer's surveys and historical documentation clearly establish his legal boundaries. Mr. Carson's claims of property damage are unsubstantiated and appear to be retaliatory in nature." Carson's face went purple. "Furthermore," Wallace continued, "regarding the concerns about Mrs. Mercer's welfare, we find no evidence of coercion or abuse. The marriage, while unconventional in its origins, appears to be valid and consensual at this time." He looked directly at Lenora. "Mrs. Mercer, this commission wants to be clear. If you ever need assistance or wish to dissolve this union, you have legal options. But based on your testimony today, we see no reason to intervene." "Thank you," Lenora said, "but I won't need those options." Wallace nodded. "Then this hearing is concluded. Mr. Mercer's boundaries are officially recognized and recorded. Mr. Carson, any further complaints will be considered harassment and dealt with accordingly." They won. Outside the building, Boone pulled Lenora into a hug that lifted her off her feet. "You were incredible," he said into her hair. "The way you stood up to them, the way you told the truth without flinching. I learned from the best," she said. "You've been standing up to people like Carson your whole life." "Not like that. Never like that." They celebrated with Morrison and his men at a decent hotel restaurant, the first proper meal Lenora had eaten in months that she hadn't cooked herself. Morrison kept praising her testimony, saying she'd made Carson look like a fool. "You made an enemy for life today," he warned. "Carson doesn't forget." "Good," Lenora said. "Neither do I." The journey home took longer because they weren't rushing. Lenora and Boone rode together in the wagon, talking more openly than they ever had. He told her about his father, about learning the ranch as a boy. She told him about her mother's garden, about the life they'd had before the drought. They were learning each other's histories, building a foundation that went deeper than survival. 3 days from home, Boone stopped the wagon on a ridge overlooking a frozen valley. "What are we doing?" Lenora asked. "Something I should have done months ago." He climbed down and helped her down, then stood there looking nervous in a way she'd never seen. "I know we're already married. Legally, officially, all the ways that matter to the territory. But like you said, that wedding wasn't yours. It was something that happened to you, not something you chose." He pulled something from his coat pocket. A ring, not the 2 big gold bands she wore on thread, but a new one. Simple silver with a small stone that caught the winter light. "Lenora Whitfield," he said, and his voice was shaking slightly. "I'm asking you now, with no debt between us, no pressure, no arrangements. Will you marry me? Actually marry me, because you want to, not because you have to?" She looked at him. This hard, damaged man who'd somehow become her partner, her friend, maybe even something more. Who'd given her everything when he could have taken. Who'd learned to hope again despite being terrified of it. "Yes," she said, "but on one condition." "What condition?" We don't have a ceremony. We don't need witnesses or a church or Pastor William stammering through vows. We just decide right here that we're choosing each other. That's enough." He nodded slowly. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. I don't need a dress or a party. I just need you to look at me and know I'm choosing this. Choosing us." Boone took her hand and slid the new ring on her finger. It fit perfectly. "I choose you," he said. "Every difficult, stubborn, brave part of you. I choose this life we're building, even when I don't know what I'm doing. I choose trying instead of hiding." "I choose you too," Lenora said. "Every silent, frustrating, unexpectedly gentle part of you. I choose our ranch, our life, our future, whatever that looks like." They kissed there on the frozen ridge while Morrison and his men politely pretended not to notice, and it felt more real than anything that had happened in that Copper Hollow church. This was their wedding, their choice, their beginning. The rest of the journey passed in a blur of cold and conversation and quiet contentment. When Mercer Ridge finally came into view, Lenora felt something she hadn't expected. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy at seeing home. When had that happened? When had this isolated ranch become home instead of prison? Maybe when she'd stopped being afraid. Maybe when Boone had stopped hiding. Maybe it had been gradual, accumulating like snow until suddenly everything was transformed. They spent the rest of winter preparing for spring, working side by side in the kind of companionable silence that came from understanding. Boone taught her more about ranching, when to move cattle, how to recognize sick animals, the thousand small details that kept a ranch running. She taught him that talking about feelings wouldn't kill him, even if it made him uncomfortable. They fought sometimes. Real arguments about stupid things, how to stack firewood, whether to expand the chicken coop, what to plant in the garden come spring. But they learned to fight fair, to listen instead of just defending. And slowly, carefully, the physical distance between them shrank. A hand on a shoulder became an arm around a waist, became sleeping in the same bed, holding each other through mountain nights that tried to freeze everything solid. It wasn't perfect. Some days Boone still retreated into himself, haunted by ghosts Lenora couldn't touch. Some days she still woke up panicked, convinced this was all temporary and would be ripped away. But they had each other. And that was enough. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it transformed everything. Snow melted into rushing streams, grass appeared where there'd been only white. The cattle moved to higher pastures, and life returned to the valley. Lenora planted apple trees beside the house, small saplings that would take years to bear fruit. Boone watched her work, leaning against the fence with that almost smile that meant he was content. "Those'll take forever to grow," he observed. "I know." She patted dirt around the last sapling. "But I'll be here to see them. We both will." "You planning that far ahead?" "Yes." "Are you?" He walked over and pulled her to her feet, dirt-covered hands and all. "Yeah, I am." They stood there in the spring sunlight, looking at the ranch they'd fought for and the life they were building. It wasn't the life either of them had planned or expected. It was harder, stranger, more complicated. But it was theirs. Word filtered back from Copper Hollow over the following months. Richard Carson had suffered several business setbacks and was quietly withdrawing from territorial politics. Pike and his raiders had been arrested for cattle theft, finally caught in the act by Morrison and his men. The town was changing, slowly becoming a place where women like Lenora could speak their minds without being destroyed for it. Or maybe the town hadn't changed at all. Maybe Lenora had just stopped caring what they thought. She and Boone went to town occasionally for supplies, and people treated them differently now. With respect, or at least with caution. The story of Lenora's testimony in Denver had spread, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some people still whispered, still judged, but their opinions mattered less and less. 1 year after the wedding that wasn't really a wedding, Boone found Lenora in the northern clearing, standing between the two graves she'd discovered months ago. "You come here often?" he asked. "Sometimes, when I'm thinking." She looked at the weathered markers. "I wanted to ask you something." "Ask." "Would it bother you if I put flowers here? Not trying to replace Sarah or anything. Just acknowledgement that they were part of your life, and now they're part of mine too, in a way." Boone was quiet for a long time. Then he knelt and cleared some weeds from around Thomas's marker. "It wouldn't bother me," he said. I think Sarah would have liked you. You got the same fire she had. What would she think about us? Honestly, she'd probably be relieved I didn't die alone up here, turning into some hermit who talked to cattle. He stood and brushed off his hands. And she'd tell me I was an idiot for waiting so long to actually court you properly. You court me every day. Coffee before I wake up. Fixing things before I notice they're broken. Teaching me things without making me feel stupid. That's not courting. That's just, yes, it is. It's your version of courting, and it works. He pulled her close, and they stood there between the graves and the living trees, between past and future. I love you, Boone said, and it was the first time he'd said those words. Didn't think I'd ever say that again to anyone, but I do. I love you. Lenora felt tears prick her eyes. I love you too. Even though you're terrible at chess and you burn eggs and you still barely talk most days. That's not much of a love confession. It's honest. That's better. They walked back to the ranch together as evening settled over the mountains. Smoke rose from the chimney. Lenore had left stew cooking for dinner. The chickens were settling in their coop. Cattle grazed in distant pastures. Everything was as it should be. Inside, they ate dinner and played chess and sat by the fire reading. The same routine they'd developed over months, but now it felt different, richer, full of the kind of contentment that came from choosing someone every single day. Later, lying in bed together, Lenora traced the scars on Boone's chest, old injuries from a life spent fighting mountains and weather and the 100 dangers that came with ranching. Tell me about this one, she said, touching a long scar below his ribs. Barbed wire. Was fixing a fence in a storm. Wire snapped and caught me. Stupid accident. And this? Bull decided he didn't like me. I disagreed. Bull lost the argument. She kissed each scar gently. Battle wounds from a life spent surviving. Evidence that he'd endured and continued. What about you? He asked. What scars you got that I can't see? She thought about that. Lost my mother when I was 16. That left a mark. Watched my father give up on life and turn to drinking. That hurt too. Being traded away like I was worthless, that's a scar that'll probably never fully heal. I'm sorry I was part of that. You were, but you're also part of the healing. She looked up at him. That's the thing about scars. They prove you survived, and sometimes the things that hurt us end up leading somewhere better. You really believe that? I'm here, aren't I? In a life I never could have imagined, with a man who drives me crazy but also makes me want to be braver. Yeah, I believe it. Boone held her closer. I don't deserve you. Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway. Good. They fell asleep like that, tangled together, two people who'd been broken in different ways, learning to be whole together. Summer came and the apple trees grew, adding inches that wouldn't mean anything for years but mattered anyway. Lenora expanded the garden, planting vegetables and herbs. Boone built new corrals and repaired the barn roof. They worked themselves tired every day and fell into bed exhausted but satisfied. Morrison visited occasionally, bringing news and gossip. The territory was settling, becoming more civilized. Towns were growing. The railroad was coming, though it would be years before it reached their part of the mountains. Things are changing, Morrison said one evening over dinner. Old ways are dying out. Men like Carson, who thought money made them kings. Their time's ending. Good, Lenora said. About time. What about you two? You planning to change with the times? Boone and Lenora exchanged glances. We're planning to keep doing what we're doing, Boone said. Ranching, surviving winters, building something that lasts. That's not changing. That's staying the same. Sometimes staying the same is the bravest thing you can do, Lenora said. When everything around you is chaos, holding on to what matters, that takes strength. Morrison nodded slowly. You might be right about that. After he left, Boone and Lenora stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The valley was painted in gold and purple, beautiful in a way that made your chest ache. You ever regret it? Boone asked. Staying here instead of taking that land and starting new somewhere easier? Every day, Lenora said honestly. Then she smiled. But I don't regret you, and the hard parts make the good parts mean more. That's a strange kind of wisdom. I learned it from a strange kind of man. He laughed. Actual laughter, something that happened more often now, but still felt precious. Fair enough? 2 years after the wedding, Lenora discovered she was pregnant. The realization came slowly, then all at once, and for a moment she was terrified. Bringing a child into this harsh world, into this isolated place, was that fair? Was it safe? She told Boone that night and watched him go through every emotion at once: fear, joy, panic, hope. "I don't know if I can do this again," he said, voice shaking. "After losing Thomas, I know, I'm scared too. What if something happens? What if I lose you both? Then you'll survive it. Like you survived before. Like we both survive everything else." She took his hands. "But maybe nothing happens. Maybe we have a healthy baby who grows up strong and stubborn like both of us. Maybe we get to be happy. I don't know how to hope for that without being terrified." "Then be terrified. We'll figure it out together." The pregnancy was hard. Morning sickness that lasted all day. Exhaustion that made simple tasks feel impossible. Boone hovered constantly, terrified she'd disappear if he looked away. "I'm not dying," she told him for the 100th time. "I'm just growing a human. Women do it all the time. Sarah was fine until she wasn't. I'm not Sarah, and we're prepared. Morrison knows a doctor in Denver who can come if needed. We have supplies. We have each other." But she understood his fear because she felt it too. Every twinge, every unusual sensation made her wonder if something was wrong. The baby came in early spring, after 12 hours of labor that Lenora would later describe was the worst thing I've ever experienced, and also somehow worth it. A girl. Small but healthy, with Boone's dark hair and Lenora's stubborn chin. They named her Clara, after Lenora's mother. Boone held his daughter like she was made of glass, tears running down his scarred face. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's wrinkly and loud," Lenora said from the bed, exhausted but happy. "But yeah, she's ours." Watching Boone with Clara over the following months transformed something in Lenora's understanding of him. He was gentle in ways she'd never imagined, patient and attentive. The fear never fully left his eyes, but love was stronger. Clara grew fast, hitting all the milestones. First smile, first laugh, first tooth. Lenora recorded everything in a journal, building a history their daughter could read someday. Life settled into a new rhythm. Harder than before, babies didn't care about ranch schedules, but richer too. Fuller. On Clara's first birthday, they invited Morrison and his family, plus a few neighbors who'd proven themselves trustworthy. Nothing fancy, just food and conversation and watching Clara destroy a small cake with her hands. "You've built something good here," Morrison said quietly to Boone. "Something worth protecting." "I know. Carson's still bitter about losing?" "Probably, but he stays away. Learned his lesson." "And you? You happy?" Boone looked across the room to where Lenora was holding Clara, both of them laughing at something. "Yeah, I am." It was the truest thing he'd ever said. Years passed the way they do. Some fast, some slow, all of them adding up to a life. Clara grew into a wild, fearless child who could ride before she could write properly. The apple trees finally bore fruit, and Lenora made pies that became legendary in the valley. The ranch prospered under their combined management. They had 2 more children, a son they named David after Morrison, and another daughter called Rose because Lenora insisted on at least one flower name. The house that had been a tomb became loud and chaotic and alive. Sometimes Lenora would catch Boone standing in the doorway watching their children play, and she knew he was thinking about Thomas, about the son he'd lost and the children he'd gained. The grief never disappeared, but it made room for new joy. "You all right?" she'd ask. And he'd say, "Yeah, just remembering how to be grateful." On their 10th anniversary, Boone surprised her with a trip to Denver. Their oldest could manage the ranch for a few days with Morrison's help. They stayed in a proper hotel and ate at restaurants and walked around the city like normal people. It was strange and wonderful and exhausting. "You miss this?" Boone asked as they watched crowds hurry past. "Civilization?" "Not even a little bit," Lenora said. "I miss our mountains, our quiet, our life. Even though it's hard, especially because it's hard, easy things don't matter as much." They went home to find everything running smoothly, their children excited to show them everything that had happened while they were gone. That night, Lenora stood on the porch looking at the ranch she'd hated at first sight and now couldn't imagine leaving. This was home. Not because it was comfortable or convenient, but because she'd chosen it. She'd chosen this life, this man, this difficult, beautiful existence in the mountains. And that choice had made all the difference. Boone came out and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking?" "That I was wrong," she said. "That day at the altar when I thought my life was over. It wasn't ending, it was just beginning in a way I couldn't understand yet." "You ever regret it? Any of it? The debt, the arrangement, being traded like property?" She turned in his arms. "Yes. I regret that we had to start that way, but I don't regret where we ended up." "Where's that?" "Here. Together. With a family and a life we built from nothing but stubbornness and hope." He kissed her forehead. "That's the thing about you. You always find a way to make even the hard parts sound good. That's because they are good. Not easy, not perfect, but good." They stood there as the last light faded from the sky, and their children's laughter drifted from inside the house. The mountains stood sentinel around them, eternal and unmoved. People weren't like mountains. People changed. They grew and adapted and survived by transforming themselves into whatever was needed. Lenora had been a poor farmer's daughter, traded away to settle a debt. She'd become a rancher's wife, a mother, a woman who knew how to shoot and survive and stand up to powerful men who thought money made them gods. Boone had been a ghost living in a tomb of memories. He'd become a husband, a father again. A man who'd learned that loving someone didn't mean you'd lose them, or that even if you did, the love was worth the risk. Together, they'd built something that mattered. Not perfect, not easy, but real and lasting, and theirs. And in the end, isn't that what survival really means? Not just enduring, but choosing to build something beautiful from the wreckage life hands you. Choosing hope over fear. Choosing each other every single day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Because the things worth having are always the things you have to fight for. And Lenora and Boone had fought. For each other. For their family. For the life they wanted instead of the one they'd been given. They'd won. Not by defeating enemies or conquering mountains, but by refusing to give up on the possibility that two broken people could become whole together. That was their story. Not perfect. Not easy. But theirs. And that was enough.